up to this point in the class, we've covered conspiracy theories and how they got their start, and we've learned some key terms in the way we'll move through the unit. So, a theme that you'll see here is that we're really breaking things down into individual pieces, then looking at how they connect to form the bigger picture. So, we're doing something similar this week. So, this week you read Neil Postman's chapter, Now This. You've completed the reading guide, theoretically. So, we can really dive into more of what he's saying in this book and connect it to your project. Neil Postman was a media theorist, critic, educator, and writer, and he wrote over 20 books on various subjects. Amusing Ourselves to Death was written in 1985 after he gave a talk comparing the modern world to Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So you may have read that in high school, but if you're not familiar with it, it essentially tells the story of a society where the public was oppressed through a cultural focus, a cultural addiction on entertainment. So, Postman's book, then, with this story in mind, guides readers through the development of technology, communication, and epistemology. And it spans quite a long period of time, moving from humans having an oral culture to a print culture to a television culture, and along the way, how our communication has shifted in a large way. A few basic terms to know to really understand this reading are public discourse, typographic culture, and epistemology. So, public discourse we can understand is basically how people are communicating in a culture, and this can include multimodal means of communication. So, it's public because it's referring to society more broadly, it involves the public. We are all a part of public discourse. Typographic culture is a specific way in which we're communicating as a culture. So, a typographic one is where citizens communicate primarily in text or written documents. So, as a result of that, citizens are mostly literate and they engage in reading regularly and more frequently than other means of communication, like video or images. Epistemology is a hard word, so it's okay if you didn't understand this fully at first. It took me a while to really wrap my head around and remember what it meant. But basically, though, it's our way of knowing. It's how you form knowledge and understanding. So, with those terms in mind, we can understand that Postman is arguing that our public discourse is being transformed by a shift in epistemology as we move from a typographic culture to a more visual, television, and media-oriented culture. The ways in which we think, speak, and interact with one another are being changed and fundamentally shifted by our consumption of information through media. So we don't think or understand things in the same way that people in a primarily typographic culture thought or understood things. And again, right, he wrote this book in the 1980s, but it continues to be eerily accurate to the ways in which we operate as a culture, especially in the United States. How does this connect to conspiracy theories, though? Well, conspiracy theories are, to some extent, the result of a public who focuses more on entertainment than on critical thinking. So when entertainment becomes an addiction, the opportunity for critical thinking dissolves. There's literally a term for it now, right? Brain rot. So we live in an era where the goal is to get people to spend more time on their phones, right? So if you've never seen the documentary The Social Dilemma, I highly recommend you check that out. It's on Netflix, and surely you can find it somewhere else on the internet if you don't have a Netflix subscription. But social media is a powerful tool that transforms our epistemologies, our ways of knowing and understanding. So we see this happening in lots of places, right? Shorter attention spans, a more hyper-focused, specialized approach to knowledge instead of learning a variety of things, and a shift in education to make things more bite-sized. So our language changes to include less complexity in vocabulary and in thought. We become convinced that we can be experts on something just from watching YouTube, which devalues the educational system. And I'm not going to say that the educational system has no issues, but when we devalue education, it leads to some really scary effects. So, in the chapter, Postman talks about how we essentially desensitize ourselves in our consumption of information, and simultaneously, we focus on how information makes us feel. So, we can consume videos or images of violence, war, disaster, and move on without taking in the full emotional toll of what that means. And at the same time, though, we want to feel comfortable in the information that we take in. And so that focus on entertainment and comfortability is something that has absolutely expanded since 1985 when this was written. And so much of social media is dependent upon making you feel some kind of way, right? So typically, exploiting people's senses of fear or anger are the most effective ways to keep you on social media, scrolling and commenting and engaging in some way, like you learned about with the bad news game, right? So again, we've got a modern way to refer to it with the term rage baiting. And there are some really obvious effects of this too, right? Which contribute to the growth and spread of conspiracy theories. And one of them is the concept of post-truth. So, post-truth is a concept that really blew my mind when I first learned about it. And it's something that I think a lot of us might observe, but we don't have the vocabulary to describe it. So, post-truth occurs when circumstances where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. So, to throw it back to your experience in English 103 or the equivalent, you might think about this as a valuation of pathos over logos. So we care about and are more likely to believe things that make us feel a certain way. And the idea here isn't that we moved past a place of, where truth exists, but what people perceive as truthful has shifted. So again, when we're focused on entertainment and don't take dedicated time to think more deeply about things, you can see how this might happen. So it leads to some really serious questions, though, like how we determine what truth really is. In his book, Post-Truth, Lee McIntyre presents the scale of truth, which gives us a way to understand how misinformation and disinformation can happen. So if you don't remember the definitions of those terms, you might check out last week's videos. But we start on the low end of the scale with falsehoods. So we can liken this to misinformation, right? You say something incorrect and you say it unintentionally, you just make a mistake. Willful ignorance comes next, and here we say something untrue, but we say it without checking whether or not it's true. So you read a headline or share an article without actually reading it or doing any additional reading to confirm whether or not the headline is accurate. Lying is the next step, where you tell something untrue and you have an intent. You want to lie, you want to mislead, you want to deceive. According to McIntyre, bullshitting is next on the scale, and this to me seems more like willful ignorance because he defines it as saying something with a careless indifference about what's true or not. And I don't know that I agree that we can really parse out the lack of care to that level. But that's what he's presenting, so we'll include it here, but you can decide for yourself what you think about that. On the most extreme end of the scale, right, we get post-truth. So here he says that post-truth is when one thinks that the crowd's reaction actually does change the facts about a lie. So even if we have lots of evidence to the contrary, if the public feels a certain way, then the emotion is truth and not the evidence. So you can see again just how this concept can be co-opted by conspiracy theories and put into practice, right? Evidence goes away because, again, according to McIntyre, there's a corruption of the process by which facts are credibly gathered and reliably used to shape one's beliefs about reality. And as a result, then he argues that when a person's beliefs are threatened by an inconvenient fact, um, sometimes it's preferable to challenge the fact. So when we engage in post-truth, we want people to believe something, whether there's evidence for it or not. And the most important thing to keep in mind here is that post-truth isn't a new thing, right? It's been around for a very long time, and it's something that exists to some extent in everybody. So it gets compounded with this idea of demagoguery, which is our next element to consider here. So, demagoguery is political activity or practices that seek support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. So, someone who practices demagoguery is called a demagogue. And basically, this boils down to trying to create an us versus them dichotomy, right? So, the demagogue leads people in a way that separates you from the other, and they look to villainize the other, right? So you want your side to win no matter what, by any means necessary. And you are also not allowed to change your mind because to think differently or to think something in dissent of the group shows that you're weak and you're other, whoever other may be. And demagoguery fits right into the problem that Postman is identifying. So when we allow our information to become entertainment, it's easy to fall into the dichotomy that demagoguery makes space for. So we get factionalized media that features talking heads like Postman discusses, right? You watch the news source that agrees with us and discredit the news source for them. And when we zoom this out, this us versus them mentality can have far-ranging negative effects, right? When we present some group of people as entirely evil, irredeemable, and a threat to our way of life, it can lead to something as horrific as genocide. Because when we want to villainize a group of people, whether that's based on race, political party, sex, gender, other identities, um, when we want to villainize a group of people and post-truth is permissible, acceptable, and even normalized due to our epistemology and media culture, all of those things get utilized to have whatever the demagogue wants, right? And nobody within that system gets the chance to change their mind. So unless people are willing to change what they're willing to accept, we're on a fast-moving train set for some really scary places. But just because there's the possibility for bad things to happen doesn't mean that we're stuck there or that we can't change anything, right? Because remember, when we talk about public discourse, we are part of the public. If we don't want demagoguery around, if we don't want post-truth to be acceptable, we can change that. We can do something about it. And that, I think, is a very hopeful thing, right? So in the face of darkness, we can be the light. So what do we do? Well, Patricia Roberts Miller, a leading scholar on demagoguery, points out this element. We can't just say something like, get rid of all the demagogues, because then we're participating in the system, right? It becomes us versus them, us versus the demagogues. And so instead, she suggests we can follow four steps. Consume less demagoguery, not engage in arguments, or maybe engaging in arguments, and supporting democratic deliberation. So, Roberts Miller recommends here that we not only try to consume less demagoguery, but that we go out of our way to interact with people who think and feel differently than us. We want to interact with different ideas. We don't have to necessarily agree with those things, and we don't need to try and persuade somebody else. But an exchange in perspectives and a willingness to hear somebody out can go a long way. So she also recommends something like a boycott for places that do promote demagoguery. And if we have social media at our disposal, this doesn't mean necessarily contributing to comment sections about how bad it is. That gets the page more attention and they make more money off of your engagement with their media. So instead, we can just block the page and move on with our day and tell people in other ways about the demagogic tendencies of whatever we're boycotting. My in-person classes get to watch this video from the West Wing. I won't show it to you here, but um, the woman in this is a lawyer going to work for the White House, and she has different political opinions in the White House and kind of stands up to people to be like, hey, it's not us versus them. We're all working together, right? So I won't play that now for you, but that's the context of why there's a video on the slide. But we get a little bit of mixed approaches from Roberts Miller when it comes to whether or not we should engage in argument with somebody about demagoguery. So an argument doesn't necessarily have to be a brawl. Those things aren't necessarily synonymous. But like we learned from Peter McIndoe in the Birds Aren't Real video, sometimes the best way to handle a conspiracy theorist and likewise here a participant in demagoguery is just to listen. Don't argue. Show compassion, show understanding, show empathy, and do it in a way that's not condescending. And you can have success in helping bring them out of the chokehold of demagoguery. So if they're not doing anything besides parroting what a demagogue has to say, it may be best to just walk away. Or if you think it could be effective, you can get into an argument, right? So this is a point where knowing your audience and using your rhetorical skills is extra important. So for instance, if you know that somebody appreciates a demagogue because of their strength, then you might want to use aggression in your approach. Asking for and providing sources can be beneficial too, especially if you can find a source that they believe to be on their side, right? But really though, you just want to try and get somebody to see that not everything is us versus them. Democratic deliberation doesn't have anything to do with the political party. It's the concept of democracy. And when we participate in democratic deliberation, we want to embody four qualities. So inclusion, fairness, responsibility, and argument. And by including others, we participate in democracy, right? Fundamentally, democracy is designed to allow all to partake. So including more people that we talk to dismantles the us versus them dichotomy. Fairness means that everybody is held to the same standards. We don't allow anybody to make lazy or ill-informed arguments, and we get that sense of fairness from a shared sense of responsibility too. So when we make an argument, it needs to be ethical and appropriate. And as we argue, embodying these other elements, we need to make sure that people are allowed to change their minds and think of something with nuance, right? So learning more and changing your perspective isn't a weakness, it's an ideal. And it shows a developing mindset. I'll leave you with this thought from Patricia Roberts Miller, which really sums all of it up. She says, demagoguery happens because it's more pleasurable to get ourselves all worked up about some other group than it is to deliberate with them. So, demagoguery is fun because it makes us feel really good about ourselves. It makes it seem that complicated and difficult issues are simple, and it can provide a kind of clarity. It isn't always bad, but it isn't always good, and it is bad if it's always.